Hi everyone, thanks for being here. So a few months ago, my family heard the following joke. How can Jews travel on planes on Shabbat? By wearing the planes via the seatbelts. Now, when my sister heard this joke, she exclaimed, "That doesn't make any sense. You can't travel on Shabbat." Now, what my sister was getting at there was that while it's true that the joke dealt with the loophole that you can carry an object by wearing it on Shabbat, it did not deal with the main issue. You cannot travel on Shabbat, period. Using halachic language, this means that you cannot travel 2,000 cubits, which is approximately 3,500 feet, on Shabbat. All people in all locales have a domain on Shabbat. Beyond this domain is a circle, a ring of 2,000 cubits farther out. On Shabbat, you can't cross that domain. You can't cross it whether you're walking or if you're even hauling your plane via your seatbelt. You cannot cross it. Now, where did this prohibition come from? Now, I'm going to introduce you to a term that you may already know, but you're going to know a lot better right now. Tehum Shabbat, the Shabbat boundary. We find reference, or we find a resource to this boundary in this week's Torah portion of Parashat Bishalach. In this Torah portion, in Bishalach, we convene and see the portion of the man, the manna from heaven. After the Israelites left the Red Sea, escaped from the Egyptians, they had no food to eat. They cried out to God. They grumbled to God. They said it would have been better had we returned to Egypt. In response, God says, I'm going to give you the man on 5 days of the week, Sunday through Thursday. You're going to go out. You're going to take one single portion. But on Friday, you're going to grab 2 portions, one for Friday and one for Shabbat. They're not supposed to go out on Shabbat to gather the man. Unsurprisingly, some of the Israelites did in fact go out on Shabbat and collect the man. In response, we learn that God says, or Moshe says through God, Re'u ki Hashem natan lachem hashabat, al ken hu noten lachem bayom hashishi lechem yomayim. See that God has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, God gives you 2 days worth of food on the 6th day. Shivu ish tachtav, al yetze ish mimkomo bayom hashavi'i. Let everyone remain where he is. Let no one leave his place on the 7th day. Now, contextually, this refers to the gatherers of the man. However, the rabbis take the verse, interpret the verse, and expand the verse, and create from it an entirely new halachic and conceptual category. According to the rabbis, the everyone in the verse doesn't just refer to the Israelites. Everyone refers to, well, everyone. All Israelites, all Jews. Everyone is not allowed to travel on Shabbat. Not only were the Israelites told to remain where they are on Shabbat, we too are told to remain in place on Shabbat. This is the institution of Tehum Shabbat. This is the domain that one is not supposed to cross on Shabbat. And it doesn't matter how that traveling is done. Jewish law says, stay where you are on Shabbat, remain where you are on Shabbat. Now, I know that this topic may sound a bit archaic to you, but I propose that deep within this category are the very resonant themes and values of separation and containment. One can only appreciate the grand world of Shabbat by being constricted to a small portion of the globe at that time. Now, while the concept of Tehum originates in Shabbat, the ramifications themselves are endless and I think meaningful. Boundaries are healthy, and they help us to make sense of the world around us. We're going to note now a couple of main features of Tehum. First is what we will call limits. Despite the prohibition to not pass the boundary on Shabbat, the rabbis did allow us to move 2,000 cubits on Shabbat. You're allowed to pass that initial border for 2,000 cubits. In order to establish a boundary, we first need to know the limits of that boundary. A second characteristic of tchum, of boundaries, is what I like to call response to boundary violation. This indicates what happens when one violates the tchum on Shabbat. The medieval commentator Rashi says that even if one were to accidentally go across the tchum on Shabbat, that person is still allowed 4 cubits in any direction. What this means is that even though there need to be consequences when you cross the boundary on Shabbat, there needs to be a leniency built into the system to deal with those times when we do cross the boundary. It's not a zero-sum game. It is true that boundaries are meant to hold us, but they're not meant to imprison us. In order to fully appreciate Tchum Shabbat, we must understand the characteristics of limits and response. Limits tells us that we need to establish boundaries. We need to know our borders. Response reminds us that boundaries are sometimes fluid. It also reminds us that the boundary is pretty much always going to be crossed by us and by others. Limits and response. They are, in my mind, the twin pillars of Tchum. And they speak to us from Parashat Bishalach all the way until today. And anytime we're thinking about boundaries, one of these two factors, limits and response, is going to clarify our thinking. Consider, for example, Disneyland. It is a contemporary example of boundary making that embraces strict limits and has very low tolerance for permeability. As part of Ramah leadership training, I've had the opportunity to go backstage, as it were, at the Disneyland theme park in California. When backstage, our tour guide sort of told us that when Disney creates its park, it looks to create an experience that is 100% Disney. You have to be totally divorced from the non-Disney world when you're in the park. However, I did learn that there was at least one occasion when this Disney-only consciousness was challenged. You see, Disney erected a new, very, very tall attraction, and the park guests reported that when they got to this top, they were able to see over Disneyland into non-Disneyland. The mirage was broken. So what did Disney do? They built up their outer scenery so that when their park guests eventually did get up to Disney, did get up to that highest point, they couldn't see Disney. They could only see Disney. The bubble was maintained. You could only see Disney, and that was the point. Disney created something masterful, a totally immersive experience for its guests. A strict tchum, the park, was established. This commitment to strict borders has very, very low tolerance. For Disney, there should never be an opportunity for people to leave the tchum until you get into your car and leave the magic behind. Some of the rabbis imagined that the concept of tchum represented the quintessential nature of Torah as a boundary. The Gemara in Yevamot retells the story from the book of Ruth when Ruth wants to go with Naomi to join Naomi's people. In this retelling, Ruth commits to observing all of the commandments of the Torah and specifically the laws of tchum. In other words, at the moment in which Ruth accepts upon herself God, Torah, and Israel, she explicitly accepts the prime law of boundary. The rabbis valorized tchum as a microcosm of Torah. Torah, according to this, is a strict tchum. On the other side of the spectrum, consider something a little bit more porous: the human skin. As the largest organ in our body, our skin generally protects us. When we jump into a pool, we expect that the water doesn't suddenly enter our insides. Our skin keeps the water out. Likewise, our skin keeps our insides safe and internal. However, at the same time, we expect our skin to sometimes be permeable. When we put lotion on our hands, on our feet, we expect the nutrients from that lotion to be able to enter our bloodstream. Likewise, when we sweat, we hope that some noxious wastes are going to exit our skin that way. An impenetrable tchum would prevent the receipt of these nourishing creams and the expulsion of noxious wastes. The skin tchum operates because sometimes it knows when to be impassable and sometimes it knows when to be passable. Both Disney and the skin work because they have tchumin. In Disney's case, the cast members reinforce this limits approach. You can't go in, you can't go out, that's it. In the skin's case, borders ensure that both desirable elements and undesirable elements can come and go as needed. It is worth noting, however, that establishing boundaries does have the potential for negative consequences, most primarily excluding individuals in unfair and unjust ways. One might say that division is actually the opposite of understanding and mutual appreciation. According to this view, tchum is archaic, perverse, and even a bit unkind. We should be as permeable as possible in order to bring society together, given the disunion that so permeates many aspects of our world. Still, it is important to distinguish between the boundaries of tchum and the boundaries of division. Division is best achieved through a wall. A wall, choma in Hebrew, while ideationally and phonetically similar to tchum, is not identical to it. The tchum is fairly porous. In the case of a city's tchum Shabbat, there's nothing but a few stakes in the ground that separates between what's in the tchum and what's outside of the tchum. And the rabbis even instituted a legal device called Erev Tchumin to allow for one person to shift their tchum from one Shabbat to the next. While it's true that a tchum restricts, it's not fully restrictive. A choma, a wall by contrast, once built, is pretty difficult to circumvent. A choma does not allow for the same fluidity as a tchum, sort of like Disney. We should prefer tchum attitudes over choma ones. Skin defeats Disney. A choma is static and unyielding, while a tchum is dynamic and flexible. We now see what's at stake by ignoring the concept of tchum and what is possible when we reintroduce ourselves to sacred yet flexible boundaries. Without tchum, we miss opportunities to establish priorities and relationships. Tchum forces us to think about the limits that we impose on ourselves and on others. And sometimes this rumination on tchum will allow us to change course, whether it's in personal behavior, personal practice, relationships, orientation. Although boundaries contain both strictness and permeability, the tchum especially privileges permeability. The rabbis even allowed for crossing the tchum in non-extraordinary circumstances. They created mechanisms for extending one's tchum, for shifting one's tchum. They even sometimes allowed for very creative means for people to re-enter into tchum should it be violated by accident. Tchum pushes in a porous direction. As the COVID crisis has taught us, boundaries maintained with care and attention save lives. And at the same time, whether via inventive halakhic solutions that allow for communal gathering, or the way that we've harnessed the power of the outdoors to be able to see friends and family, we all know now more than ever that sometimes it's just beyond the tchum, just beyond the boundary, when lives can really be enriched. Tchum represents both the limit and the breathing. Tchum urges us to accept boundaries. It is the quintessential Jewish boundary that asks to hold, not imprison, to contain, not confine. Thank you, everyone.